Black Hollow was a place where the sun beat down hard, and life was even harder. Nestled between dusty hills and a winding river, it wasn't a friendly place. Folks there were tough, weathered by the elements and the constant struggle to make a living. But even in Black Hollow, there was respect. Folks respected the law, and they respected Sheriff Thomas. Sheriff Thomas wasn't just a man with a badge. He was the glue holding the town together. He was fair, firm, and always ready to lend a hand. He knew everyone by name, knew their troubles, and did his best to keep the peace. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, and in that time, he'd seen Black Hollow through droughts, dust storms, and hard times. He was a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the toughest places, there was still law and order. And he had a son, Caleb, who looked up to him more than anything. Then, one day, everything changed. The sun was high, baking the streets, and folks were going about their business. Sheriff Thomas was walking back to his office after having lunch at the diner. Suddenly, shots rang out. 2, then 3, shattering the afternoon calm. People screamed and ducked for cover. Sheriff Thomas crumpled to the ground, his badge glinting in the sun. The shooter, a masked figure, disappeared down a side alley. The whole thing happened so fast. Within moments, chaos erupted. Some ran to help the sheriff, while others just stood frozen, staring in disbelief. The unthinkable had happened. The man who kept Black Hollow safe was gone. The town was plunged into darkness, and the future was uncertain. The respect that held the town together seemed to vanish with the echo of the gunshots. Caleb was at school when he heard the news. A boy burst into the classroom, shouting about the shooting. Caleb's heart leaped into his throat. He raced out of the school and towards the town center, his mind reeling. He pushed through the crowd gathered around his father, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. He knelt beside his father, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch his arm. Sheriff Thomas's eyes were closed, his face still. Caleb felt a wave of grief wash over him, so strong it almost knocked him over. Tears streamed down his face as he realized his father was gone. He noticed the sheriff's badge lying beside him, slightly tarnished but still shining. Caleb picked it up, clutching it tightly in his hand. In that moment, something changed inside him. The boy was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. The next day, the town held a somber gathering. Everyone was there, their faces etched with sadness and worry. The mayor stepped forward, his voice shaking, and announced they needed a new sheriff. A murmur went through the crowd. Who would be brave enough to take on the job, especially after what happened to Sheriff Thomas? Suddenly, Caleb stepped forward. He held up his father's badge, the metal gleaming in the sunlight. "I will," he said, his voice clear and firm, despite the tremor in his hands. A gasp rippled through the crowd. A 14-year-old boy? Sheriff? People started whispering, shaking their heads. It was madness, they thought. But Caleb stood tall, his eyes fixed on the crowd, determined to honor his father's memory and bring law back to Black Hollow. The weight of the town, it seemed, had settled squarely on his young shoulders. The mayor, after a long pause, agreed to let Caleb try. He knew the town was desperate, and no one else had stepped up. Caleb pinned his father's badge to his shirt, the metal cold against his skin. He strapped on his father's revolver, the handle thick and heavy in his hand. It felt enormous, almost comically so, hanging from his small frame. Walking into the sheriff's office felt strange. Everything was just as his father had left it, but his father wasn't there. The desk seemed too big, the chair too wide. He sat down, and his feet barely touched the floor. He tried to imagine his father, sitting there, calm and in charge, but all he could see was the image of him lying in the street. The weight of the badge and the gun felt heavier than ever. This was going to be harder than he thought. It wasn't long before trouble started brewing. A gang called the Rattlers, who had always been a nuisance, began to get bolder. With Sheriff Thomas gone, they saw an opportunity to take control of Black Hollow. They started robbing stores, harassing people, and generally making life miserable for everyone. Caleb knew he had to do something, but he felt lost. He was just a kid. The revolver was heavy and awkward, and he wasn't even sure how to use it properly. He tried to question people about the Rattlers, but they just laughed at him or told him to go home and play cowboys. The town was losing hope, and Caleb felt like he was failing them and failing his father. Black Hollow was slipping further into darkness, and he didn't know how to stop it. The Rattler's actions were a direct challenge to his authority, a test he wasn't sure he could pass. But Caleb wasn't one to give up easily. He knew he had to start somewhere. He started small. He noticed a kid stealing apples from the general store. Instead of ignoring it, like everyone else might have, Caleb walked right up to him. His voice trembled a little, but he said, "Those aren't yours. You need to put them back and apologize to Mr. Henderson." The kid, surprised, hesitated, then reluctantly returned the apples. It was a small thing, but it was a start. People saw it. They saw that Caleb, despite his age and fear, was trying to do his job. It wasn't much, but it was a spark of hope in the growing darkness. It showed that even the smallest act of courage could make a difference, and that Caleb wasn't going to back down, no matter how scared he was. He was serious about being the sheriff. One evening, while sitting in the sheriff's office, feeling more lost than ever, a knock came at the door. An old man stood there, his face weathered and lined, his eyes holding a quiet strength. It was Jedediah, a retired deputy who had worked with Caleb's father for years. "Heard you were trying to fill Thomas's boots," Jedediah said, his voice raspy. "Thought you might need some help." Caleb's heart leaped. Jedediah was a legend in Black Hollow. He knew the town like the back of his hand, and he knew how to handle trouble. I don't know what to do," Caleb admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Jedediah smiled, a rare and precious thing. "Then it's a good thing I do," he said. "Let's get started." Caleb had found an ally, someone who believed in him, and someone who could help him bring law back to Black Hollow. He wasn't alone anymore. Jedediah started teaching Caleb the ropes. He showed him how to track, how to read the land, and how to anticipate trouble. He taught him how to handle the revolver, how to shoot straight, and, more importantly, when not to shoot at all. He also taught him about people. Being a sheriff ain't just about guns and badges, Jedediah explained. It's about understanding folks, listening to their problems, and finding a way to help. He made Caleb walk the streets, talk to the townsfolk, and learn their stories. Caleb learned that being a sheriff was about being a leader, a protector, and a friend. He learned that true strength wasn't about being the biggest or the toughest, but about having the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard. He was growing up fast, learning lessons that most kids his age couldn't even imagine. Then, the Rattlers crossed the line. They robbed the Black Hollow Bank, taking all the town's savings. This wasn't just petty crime. This was a direct attack on the heart of the community. Fear gripped Black Hollow. People were talking about leaving, about giving up on the town altogether. Caleb knew he couldn't let that happen. He had to stop the Rattlers, not just for himself, but for his father, for Jedediah, and for everyone who still believed in Black Hollow. He gathered what information he could, talked to witnesses, and started piecing together a plan. This was it, his first real test as sheriff. And he knew, deep down, that the future of Black Hollow depended on him. The time for small acts was over. It was time for a showdown. He felt the weight of the revolver, but this time, it felt different. It felt like a tool, not a burden. Caleb knew he couldn't face the Rattlers alone. He needed help. He went to the townsfolk, the same people who had doubted him, and asked them to stand with him. He spoke with passion, reminding them of his father's dedication and of their own strength. He told them that if they didn't fight for Black Hollow, they would lose it forever. To his surprise, some agreed to help. Old Man Henderson, the general store owner, offered his shotgun. Sarah, the blacksmith, volunteered to make barricades. Even a few of the younger men, who had once laughed at him, stepped forward. It wasn't a large army, but it was enough. Caleb, with Jedediah by his side, had inspired a flicker of hope, a willingness to fight for their home. He was no longer just a boy playing sheriff. He was a leader, and people were following him. The showdown was coming, and Black Hollow was ready. Caleb, with Jedediah's guidance, used his knowledge of Black Hollow to set a trap. He knew the Rattlers would try to escape through the old mine shafts on the edge of town. He positioned his small group of defenders strategically, using the buildings and alleyways as cover. They blocked off the main roads, forcing the Rattlers towards a mine. Sarah's barricades were strong, and Henderson's shotgun was loaded. Caleb, remembering his father's words, focused on protecting the townspeople. The plan was simple: contain the Rattlers, force them into the open, and capture them without anyone getting hurt. It was a risky plan, but it was the best they had. Caleb knew that the Rattlers were dangerous, but he also knew that they underestimated him, and that was their biggest mistake. He was ready to use their arrogance against them. The Rattlers, weighed down with bags of money, swaggered into the trap. They saw the barricades, but they just laughed. "Think a few sticks of wood are going to stop us, kid?" Their leader, a scarred brute named Jake, sneered. "Where's your pa, boy?" Still hiding behind his desk. They underestimated Caleb, seeing only a child playing dress-up. Caleb stood his ground, his face grim. "This is as far as you go, Jake," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Drop the money and come quietly." Jake roared with laughter. "You in what army, kid?" He gestured to his gang, who were already reaching for their guns. They were confident, arrogant, and completely oblivious to the danger they were in. They thought they were facing a scared little boy, but they were wrong. They were facing the sheriff of Black Hollow, and he was ready to fight for his town. Caleb nodded to Henderson, who fired a warning shot into the air. The Rattlers, startled, scattered for cover. The plan was working. They were contained. But Jake was quick. He barked orders, and the Rattlers started firing back, aiming at the barricades and the buildings where Caleb's defenders were hiding. The gunfight had begun. Caleb, despite his training, was terrified. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and the air filled with smoke. He saw Sarah duck behind a metal sheet as bullets ricocheted off it. He realized that this wasn't a game. These were real bullets, and people could get hurt. The Rattlers were more organized and more dangerous than he had anticipated. His plan, it seemed, was starting to fall apart. He had underestimated the Rattlers' desperation and their willingness to fight. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Caleb's arm. He'd been hit. He stumbled, dropping his revolver. Jedediah rushed to his side, helping him behind cover. "You all right, kid?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Caleb gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain. "I'm fine," he lied, grabbing his father's revolver again. He looked around, his heart sinking. Henderson was pinned down, and Sarah was struggling to reinforce the barricade. The Rattlers were gaining ground. He knew he had to do something, and fast. Taking a deep breath, Caleb peeked out from behind the building and fired. The shot was wild, but it distracted the Rattlers for a moment. He had to keep fighting, even if he was scared and hurt. He couldn't let his fear cripple him. Black Hollow was counting on him. Seeing Caleb wounded seemed to embolden the Rattlers. They pressed their attack, firing relentlessly. Just when things looked bleakest, Jedediah stepped forward, his old eyes blazing with determination. He moved with surprising speed, taking down 2 Rattlers with well-aimed shots. His actions bought Caleb and the others some time to regroup. With Jedediah leading the charge, the tide began to turn. Henderson, inspired by Jedediah's bravery, found a new firing position. Sarah managed to reinforce the barricade, providing better cover. The Rattlers, caught off guard by the renewed resistance, started to falter. The odds were still stacked against them, but with Jedediah's help, Caleb and the townspeople were holding their own. The fight for Black Hollow was far from over, but they now had a fighting chance. Caleb, his arm throbbing, realized they needed to change tactics. He remembered something Jedediah had taught him: know your ground and use it to your advantage. He knew the maze of alleyways and hidden passages better than anyone, including the Rattlers. He signaled to Jedediah, and together they started moving through the shadows, using the alleyways to flank the Rattlers. They used their knowledge of the town to their advantage, appearing and disappearing, confusing and disorienting the gang. The Rattlers, used to open spaces, were lost and vulnerable in the close quarters. Caleb, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect his town, was outmaneuvering them at every turn. He was turning the Rattlers' confidence into confusion and fear. He was finally becoming the sheriff Black Hollow needed. Caleb found himself face to face with Jake, the Rattlers' leader, in the deserted town square. Jake was furious, his face contorted with rage. "You little sneak," he snarled. "You're going to pay for this." The remaining rattlers had either fled or been captured. It was down to this, a final showdown. Caleb stood firm, his hand steady on his revolver. "It's over, Jake," he said. "There's nowhere left to run." Jake laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. He lunged at Caleb, swinging a heavy wrench. Caleb dodged the blow, remembering his father's training. He knew he couldn't win a straight fight. Jake was too big and too strong. He had to use his wit, his knowledge of the town, and Jake's own arrogance against him. He had to be smarter. He was tired, hurt, and scared, but he wouldn't back down. Black Hollow depended on it. Caleb led Jake on a chase through the square, dodging behind barrels and weaving between buildings. He lured Jake towards the old well in the center of the square, remembering something his father had told him. "Always know your surroundings, son. They can be your best weapon." Jake, blinded by rage, didn't notice the loose planks covering the well. As he lunged at Caleb again, Caleb sidestepped, and Jake stumbled, his foot catching on the rotten wood. With a yell, Jake fell into the well, the wrench clattering beside him. Caleb quickly pulled the remaining planks over the opening, trapping Jake inside. He pointed his revolver at the well. "Stay there, Jake," he said, his voice firm. "It's over." He had disarmed and captured Jake without firing a single shot. He had won. Soon, the remaining rattlers were rounded up and arrested. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. They looked at Caleb, not as a boy playing sheriff, but as a hero. He had saved their town. The bank's money was recovered, and order was restored to Black Hollow. Caleb, exhausted but proud, stood tall as the town celebrated. He had faced his fears, outsmarted a dangerous gang, and brought law back to the streets. He had proven himself, not just to the town, but to himself. He was no longer just Sheriff Thomas's son. He was Sheriff Caleb, a true leader who had earned the respect of Black Hollow. The Rattler's reign of terror was over, thanks to the courage and determination of a 14-year-old boy. In the days that followed, life in Black Hollow slowly returned to normal. The bank reopened, and people started rebuilding their lives. Caleb, though still young, found himself settling into his role as sheriff. He was still learning, still making mistakes, but he was also growing stronger and wiser with each passing day. He walked the streets with a newfound confidence, his father's revolver still a bit too big for his belt, but his badge shining brightly. The townspeople greeted him with smiles and nods of respect. They knew that Black Hollow was safe again, not because of some miracle, but because of the courage and determination of a young boy who had dared to step up when no one else would. He had grown up too fast, but he had done it with grit, grace, and a deep love for his town. He was, without a doubt, the sheriff Black Hollow needed. One evening, Caleb stood alone in his father's office, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. He looked at his father's badge, the one he had clutched so tightly after his father's death. It was tarnished and worn, but it still shone with a quiet dignity. He understood now the weight that badge carried, the responsibility, the sacrifice, and the honor. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of hope, a promise to protect, and a commitment to justice. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was ready. He would continue to learn from Jedediah, listen to the townspeople, and uphold the law to the best of his ability. He was the sheriff of Black Hollow, and he would not let them down. He was ready to continue his work. He knew that his father would be proud. The next morning, Caleb walked out into the bright sunshine, the air clean and fresh. He saw Jedediah sitting on the porch of the general store, watching him approach. Jedediah smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice gruff but filled with warmth. Caleb smiled back, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We did good, Jedediah," he corrected. He knew he couldn't have done it without Jedediah's help, without the support of the townspeople, and without the memory of his father guiding him. He was still just a 14-year-old boy, but he was also the sheriff of Black Hollow, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun shone down on Black Hollow, a symbol of hope and a testament to the courage of a young boy who had become a hero. The end.